So, let me just get this out of the way here. Okay. So, yeah, I'll just go over kind of the basic steps when it comes to composting. Um, and I guess first and foremost, just like what is composting? It's a very simple concept. It's a natural occurrence of, the breakdown of organic material um, through use of organisms. Um, to create a nutrient dense fertilizer, natural fertilizer for your soil. So essentially you're taking, full scraps that look like this, and over a process of organisms, and it's microscopic organisms, microbes, larger insects and things like that are breaking down that material. And eventually over a process of a couple of months, depending on how productive your compost is, will turn it into a rich black fertilizer. So this happens naturally in nature, but what we're doing with the system, the 3-bin system that you guys have, it's designed or it's set up in a way to promote the optimal output of compost. So you're able to break down your product a lot quicker than you would naturally, for instance. So it's just the 3-bin system is set up in a way for it to be as quick and efficient as possible. And then we'll talk about how that works. So two concepts that are very important when it comes to composting is aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic is relating to involving or requiring oxygen. And that's the kind of composting that we're focusing on when we do the 3-bin system. And aerobic composting, essentially what it is there's natural occurring microbes that exist all around us, in the air, on our food, on all organic material. And it lives in the moisture on the surrounding of the organic material. And we're basically trying to promote their existence. So we want to increase their population, and set up a situation for them, or an environment for them to thrive. So basically what they do is they digest the material, and they produce byproducts that come out as heat, water, and CO2. Now CO2, yes, is a greenhouse gas, but the amount of that you're producing from compost is not very significant. Not to mention it's not as harmful as, say, methane, which anaerobic composting produces. And it's important to know anaerobic, even though we're doing aerobic composting, sometimes what can happen when you're doing that type of composting is if it's not managed properly, it can turn into anaerobic. And that's when you may need to adjust your process. But essentially, anaerobic composting is the absence of oxygen. And these are microorganisms that do not require oxygen. They thrive and survive without it. And the majority of their energy that's released is in the form of methane gas. So very, very harmful stuff. This is the one reason that we want to try and keep compost out of the landfills, because when we send our organic material to landfills, it becomes anaerobic composting that they do there, it becomes compacted, or they may even purposely try to use anaerobic methods, which is very harmful to our environment. Not to mention just the expense that it takes to truck this organic material to to the landfills. So by doing it on site, by doing it in your backyard, you're promoting beneficial microorganisms, and you're also you're preventing unnecessary travel or harmful elements to the ecosystem or to our environment by doing it in your backyard. So those are just kind of some of the reasons, some of the things you need to know about composting. So, of course, like I said, one of the reasons is to reduce waste. Another reason is because compost is extremely beneficial to our soils. Healthy soils produce healthy food, and then healthy food also is great for healthy people. So, or a compost, otherwise known as humus, it's a conditioner for the soil. So it actually has a very unique structure in itself that it helps retain water, and it releases it slower to the soil and to the plant. So the plant can absorb moisture and nutrients when it needs it. And it's much more, it's released much more effective for the plant. So it's going to absorb it when it needs it, and it makes the plant's production more effective or more efficient. And as I mentioned, so it's a great store of CO2 as well. So compost does take a lot of atmospheric carbon, stores it inside the soil, as well as the material you're putting in your compost helps stores it as well. So very good reasons to compost for that. So we're focusing on the small to mid scale, which is the 3-bin system here. So that's kind of the main one that we'll be focusing on today. These principles that we learn here, you can apply to small scale, which are these individual bins on the side, but we'll mainly be focusing on this 3-bin system, which you guys have. And so the reason we do these, or the reason we use these systems, is because they're very effective. They are the dimensions of each cell. So there's 3 cells in here, and each cell is 3 by 3 by 3, so 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And that allows for what's known as critical capacity. So when this bin is full, what it has been discovered is that compost will break down most efficiently in this system, because you're allowing for maximum heat production, and the heat will impact all corners of the bin, and you're allowing just for control management of the system itself. So if managed effectively or properly, your compost, once you have this filled, within 3 months you should have usable compost. Whereas if it was just composted naturally, it may take up to a year sometimes. So this is just a very, very efficient way to break that stuff down. We use the cedar wood because cedar wood has a natural occurring chemical in it, which makes it more rot resistant than other woods. So it will stand the test of time over the period of use that you guys have it for. And the other benefit as well is that we line it with metal. Now, the reason we line it with metal mesh is, for one, it allows oxygen in, but it also keeps the rodents and pests out, so our furry little friends that we don't want. It helps keep those things away and at bay. So, and we'll talk more about how we can do that more effectively as well, just not using the mesh. So what kinds of things should we be putting in the compost? Most of our organic scraps can go in there, but some things you have to be careful of. But essentially what you're going to be looking for is, garden trimmings, kitchen scraps, grass clippings, leaves. Those are the kinds of things that we want to see in there. And we can break it down into a little bit more detail. So you can put your peels, your orange potato peels, the carrot tops, your cores. You can put cardboard, egg cartons, egg shells, even tea bags. You can put in there, but they should be the paper tea bags, not those silk bag ones that they've started making. Very elegant, but they don't break down. These ones, if you are going to put your tea bag in there, it's a good idea to tear them up. Same with the cardboard or any paper that you're going to put in there. It's a good idea to shred it or to tear it. The reason you want to shred these things is because if you were to put a lot of, say, a cardboard in there or a lot of leaves on top of each other and they get wet, what happens is it compacts. And if it compacts, then it resorts to anaerobic composting, as I mentioned earlier, which is and that produces methane gas. So it's a good idea to shred this stuff because it helps create structure within your bin and allows for oxygen flow between the material. So if you are going to use these materials, it's fine, but just don't pack it on top of each other, and you should shred it as much as possible. I'll go back to the slide actually here. So one thing we highlight is to chop, mix, and bury. So you do want to chop any material. I think a big mistake that people make is when they put, say, garden trimmings or something like that in their compost bin, they don't chop it up. So they'll take a full tomato vine or a full pepper plant, and they'll just throw that into the compost bin. They'll put branches in there and stuff like that. And what happens is it's just you put a full plant in there, a full branch, and it's not going to break down in time. Like, that's going to take probably up to a year, if not more than that, to break down properly. So it's very important to chop your material, and you're looking for about 3 inches. So each piece that you put in there should be shredded or broken up into about a 3-inch section. One of the reasons you want to do that is because you're exposing the material on the inside of the organic material to organisms. So for instance, if you put an apple in your bin and you don't cut it up, you put a whole apple in there. I've done that before, and I've come back 2 or 3 months later and I've seen that the apple is still whole. It's very soft and it's rotten, but the skin itself is protecting the inside, so organisms are not able to get to it and digest it. So it's very important to chop that stuff up, expose all the inside material, expose all the inside flesh to the organisms, that especially with your hard branches, such as if you have wood branches in there from your trees, your plants coming out of your garden, chop those things up, because if you don't, it's going to take a long time to break down. And by chopping it up, you're just allowing the organisms to get to the soft part of the plant so they can break it down properly. So that's usually probably the most common mistake people do, is they put it in whole and they find that it doesn't break down. So just something to keep in mind. Some things to keep out of your compost. So we want to stay away from meat products, bones, dairy, obviously glass and metal. Those things don't break down. They're not they're organic, but they don't break down in our compost. Cooked food. So cooked food can be a little touchy. Like if you're talking about pasta or like even rice or something, those things obviously can go in there. But the rule of thumb is if you're going to be putting cooked food in there, make sure you stay away from oily foods. So if you cooked a dish and you use a lot of oil in it, you should not put that in the compost because oil doesn't decompose.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay. No, that's clear. Yeah,
Okay.
I get it. Yeah, good.
All right, perfect. The other thing is kitty litter, like dog waste and stuff like that. That stuff should not go in there either. The other thing is wheat. So this is a dandelion or any other weed, for instance, and I know what people might be thinking. That's organic, that's from the garden. Why can't that go in the compost? So a weed can go in the compost, but if it has started to seed, if it has gone to seed, don't put that in the compost, because if you put that into the compost and it gets it doesn't, your compost doesn't get hot enough to kill the seed, what's going to happen is you will spread that over your garden the next year when you spread the compost. And the seeds will go with it, and then you're going to find a bunch of weeds popping up. So if you can avoid weeds, by all means do that. But the rule of thumb is as long as it hasn't gone to seed, you can put it into your compost. All right. So what's what you're looking for now now that you know what's going in your compost is how do you put it in, and that determines everything, and that's going to determine how well your compost breaks down. So these are decomposers. Like I mentioned before, I said microorganisms break down the material, but it's not just the microorganisms. You're actually setting up a buffet of food for a number of different organisms, such as larger insects and things like that. So you're creating an ecosystem with inside the bin, and you want to make it as effective as possible. So diversity is key. Right? The more diverse your product is or compost is, the more diverse your nutrients will be for your plants. So if you open the bin and you find these little creatures in there, I know they're not pretty to look at, but they're actually very, very beneficial. The way it works is a food web. So your compost is creating fungus and certain bacterias. The mites eat those things, and then the bigger insects eat the mites, and so on and so forth. And as they eat and digest the food and deposit their waste, they're adding nutrients to the compost as well. So I said, the more diverse it is, the better it is for your soil. How are you going to make it diverse? So you want to maintain what's known as a CN ratio, carbon nitrogen ratio of 30 to 1, 25 to 30 to 1. I don't want to get caught up too much on this actual ratio. I'll tell you exactly kind of how it looks like visually, but essentially what it is you're looking for 30 parts carbon, and carbon refers to the browns. The reason they're called browns is because typically these products or these items are, they're dry and they're dead, and they're actually brown in color. And then the nitrogen are typically green material. They're fresh. Those are the things that come out of your kitchen counter, such as plants, vegetables, things like that. And you want to maintain a ratio of 30 to 1. So I'll just go into a little bit more detail on what that looks like. So for browns, you're talking about leaves, straw, paper, sawdust, wood chips, things like that. When we talk about leaves, in terms of browns, we mean dry leaves. If the leaf is still green and it has that freshness to it, that's still considered a nitrogen. So just be considerate of that. But if it dries out, then it's considered a brown. Greens, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, and manure if you have it. But again, we're talking about cows, horses, and poultry and things like that. The reason we're okay with this manure and not cat and dog manure is because horses and cows don't eat meat. So their waste is actually very healthy. All right, so now that we know what we're putting in there, is how do we put it in? So this is known as a compost lasagna. And essentially what you're doing is you're layering your browns and greens. So typically what you would, I think you said, Kwame, you have wood chips on site, right?
Yes, we do.
Okay,
we do.
so wood chips in this case probably are going to be mainly your brown source. And I'll go back to the ratio here. So remember I said that there's a ratio of 30 to 1, the CN ratio, which is the carbon nitrogen ratio. If you look at wood chips, for instance, so they have 300, sometimes actually 700. So for every 1 part of nitrogen in wood chips, there's 300 to 700 parts of carbon. So that's how much more carbon is in wood chips than there is nitrogen. So these are a very, very dense carbon material. And just to give you a comparison, if you look at vegetable scraps, it's only 12 or 20 to 1. So what that means is for every one piece of nitrogen or one part of nitrogen in vegetable scraps, there's only 20 parts of carbon. So when you compare that to wood chips, it's significantly different. This is very dense in carbon. So if you are going to be using wood chips, you don't have to use a lot of it to maintain that 30 to 1 ratio. Essentially what you would be doing then is in those bins, I would line the bottom with wood chips. And you can do maybe 2 to 3 inch layer, and that's great because it will help absorb a lot of the runoff from the compost. And then you can start layering in your green material. And the green material should be about 3 inches. And that can be your vegetable scraps, your grass clippings, all that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, you're going to put another layer of wood chips. And the wood chips at this point should only be about 1 to 2 inches max. I would actually say just 1 inch. So 3 inches greens, 1 inch of your wood chips, 3 inch greens, 1 inch of your wood chips. And you repeat that method until you've capped up, until you get to the top, at which point you can put some soil on top, or you can cap it off with wood chips as well. Once you've hit the capacity within your cell, that's at that point, you're going to let it sit for about 7 to 10 days. And then you're going to start to turn the material. So I'll go back to this bin here. So if you imagine this is the cell that you guys have at your site. So you can imagine what you're going to do is before you put any of your compost in here, you're going to first open the lid, and line it with wood chips, about 2 to 3 inches of wood chips. And then you're going to start dumping in your green bins. The green bins, again, should have the stuff that we talked about in it. And you're going to do about 3 inches of that. Or sorry, you're going to do about, you can do 3 inches of greens. And then you're going to do about 1 to 2 inches of wood chips. And then you're going to continue that process until you've hit the top. Once you get to the top, you're at capacity. Then you just cap it off with some soil. You put an inch or two layer of soil, or you can use the wood chips on top. Let it sit for about 7 to 10 days inside there. Don't touch it. And then you're going to come and turn it. Now, how you turn it, you can either turn it within the cell, or you can take the material and literally flip it into the next one with a shovel or a fork and put it into this one. It's okay at that point if you mix all the material, because you do want to have that interaction between the materials. At that point, it's perfectly fine. So you're going to have it mixed either with inside the bin, and you can use a fork or a shovel and just turn the material, or you can literally shovel it out into the next one. And then you're going to let it sit for another 7 to 10 days, and then you're going to repeat the process. Because you guys only have 3 cells, it may be best to do that within. It may be best to do that within the cell, because you're going to run out of. You're going to run out of space if you decide to put it from one cell to the next. And I will talk about that process a little bit more, but let's just continue on with in general. So does the layering process make sense, Kwame?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. And I have one gardener here with me. So
okay.
So he's one of the main guys here in the garden. So it's good we have Jamel. Jamel is here. Jamel, you want to say hello to Alonso?
Hello, Alonso. How are you doing today?
Not bad. How are you doing?
Okay,
I'm doing great.
Sorry, what was your name? Sorry.
My name is Jamal.
Jamal. All right, great. Well, nice to virtually meet you. Anyway.
Nice to meet you as well. This is a great plan I'm seeing right now as far as the scheme of things and what we could be doing for, I guess, it's a new plan called the compost lasagna.
Yeah, so that's just a method by which people use to layer their compost. And most people know what a lasagna is, so it's easy to have that image in your mind of layers of material to kind of set up your compost. So yeah, that's why it's called compost lasagna.
Very creative.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of at that point now. We're just kind of explaining how to layer the material in your bin. And as I explained to Kwame, so in the bins that they have there in Kipling, you're doing 3 inches of green material, and I explained what that was, to 1 to 2 inches of wood chips, and then you repeat that method until your bin is full.
That's correct. Yes, yeah. It's very simple. Yes,
absolutely. So, so once the bin is full, you got to keep your pile aerated. Now, as I mentioned before, this is aerobic composting, so it depends on oxygen. If you don't have enough oxygen, it will become anaerobic, and then that's when you produce methane gas and things like that. So if you don't want to actually turn the pile, or if there's not somebody to turn the pile on site, there's different methods by which you can aerate it. So some people will put tubes that have perforated holes in it, and that'll put that right down to the bottom. And you do a couple of those throughout the bin, and that will allow oxygen to get to the middle of the compost pile. Some people use sticks or branches and roots and things like that, and that just helps maintain the structure in the compost, the porosity, if you will, and that just allows for airflow throughout the material as well. So that's one method. Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. Yes, because we're not using right now. We're not using any of that sort right now. So we definitely need to get some type of oxygen inside of our compost piles, just so it's not smelling bad.
Exactly. You want to make sure that it doesn't start to produce methane gas and smell awful. So this is just one method, but I think the best method is to turn material. And the reason that is because you're exposing all of the material in the middle of your piles to the oxygen. So all the organisms that are in there that are breaking down the material, they're going to get a breath now, and they're going to get that life and that oxygen back into their system. And it's going to help them reproduce and be more productive. So this is the best method, I would say. And if you can't use that, there's also like a plunger tool. So basically, essentially what that is you put it into the material, and as you pull it out, the anchors open up and it pulls material out with it, which then creates a hole throughout the material, throughout your bin. And that also allows for oxygen flow.
So it looks like from our situation here, the turning the pile mixes is the option that we will be relying on. So this is after 10 days.
So I would say 7 to 10 days within that time frame. Yeah, but 10 days is fine. If you want it to be like optimal, I would say every 7 days would be the best to turn it. But if you're doing it within 7 to 10, then you're fine.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And the other reason you want to do that is because it gives you a chance to check the moisture of the material. Because again, these are organisms that depend on moisture and oxygen. So they need to get a drink once in a while too. If it gets too dry, your compost pile may become dormant and stop breaking down. So you want to make sure that it's still moist. And when you're turning it, you'll get a chance to see what's happening on the inside. And then maybe, oh, okay, I need to add some water. And when you add water, it's simple as just like spraying a hose on it or taking a bucket and just splashing some water on the material. But essentially what you're looking for is, they say about 40 to 60% moisture content. And in terms of what that physically looks like or feels like, if you imagine like a damp sponge, so if you had a wet sponge and you wrung it out, what it feels like after, that's just that damp sponge, that's kind of what you're aiming for with your compost. Another way to think about it is if you were to take your material, the compost, and you were to put it into a ball, if it maintains its structure, then you know you have good moisture. If it falls apart and it crumbles and it's way too dry, and if you're noticing that there's water like soaking out or leaking out, then it's too wet. And there's ways to control that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's definitely important to make sure that your compost maintains its moisture, because if not, it may go dormant. Okay.
That's very straightforward.
Sorry?
It's very straightforward.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is something, I mean, if there's people who are not familiar with composting, it's quick, something that they'll learn quickly. The more you do it, but it's something that you'll get a good handle on as the process goes on.
Okay.
So if the way to test your compost if it's finished, so essentially I'll go back to this bin here. So if we're managing this adequately and in the most optimal way possible, what you're looking at is you're going to fill this bin hopefully within a week or so, and maybe even a couple days. You're going to fill it with your browns and your greens. You're going to let it sit for 7 to 10 days. What I would recommend is maybe after the first 7 to 10 days, turn it to this cell. And then that way you'll have this cell now can be left open for new material while this one is breaking down. And then every 7, sorry?
No, exactly. It's a process. It's a step-by-step process that once the 7 to 10 days is up, then you transfer to the middle one.
Exactly. Yeah. and after that point, it's up to you. Like what you can do is you can put it into the third one and let it, and then turn it within the cell at that point. But every 7 to 10 days, you want to turn it. You can just turn it within the cell, or you can bring it to the next one. But essentially, that's what it is. It's just a process. And then if you're doing that every 7 to 10 days, you're maintaining the moisture. The temperature is getting up. It should hit. What you're looking for is maximum of 160 degrees. That's kind of what you want to hit. That will last for about a few days. And then afterwards, we'll start to taper off slowly over a couple months from 140 to 100 degrees. And then within 2 to 3 months, probably around 3 months, you should have usable compost. So how you'll know it's ready. So there's a couple of ways to tell. So if it's this dark, rich, kind of crumbly and loose material, and it has that earthy smell, then you know you're ready. It doesn't smell bad. It smells actually very good. It smells like earth. It smells like soil. The other options that you can do are you have a sealed bag test. So what you can do is you can take some of the compost from the bin, put it into a Ziploc bag, seal it. Make sure you keep it out of the sun, just because you may end up. Well, I'll tell you the reason why, and then I'll explain why I keep it out of the sun. So once you seal the bag, if you're finding that there's condensation building up on the inside of the bag, what that's telling you is that the material is still breaking down. So it's not ready to be used yet. But you make sure you keep it out of the sun, because if you put it in the sun, then obviously the atmospheric air on the outside is going to be hotter. So then you may get condensation on the inside of the bag, which doesn't mean that it's still breaking down. It just means that the moisture is evaporating and it's collecting on the bag. So if you are going to use this test, just keep it in the shade or inside somewhere out of the sun. And then the other test is a germination test. So if you take a seed and put it into your compost and it germinates, then you know you're good to go.
Okay, so I have some few technical questions.
Sure.
When is the best time to do composting? The reason I'm asking this is that already we are in a season.
Yep.
In our case here, we now have residents bringing in their food waste. And I know the season is going to be maybe in the next 3 months, right? And from what you're saying, this thing has to take about 3 months for us to get a full compost. So by the time that I know that if you have to go by this schedule, wait for 3 months, it will be somewhere in August, September, and that is where there's a season for harvesting. So it's done. So technically, are we on track? Is it the best year for us? Should we have to wait for 3 months, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the simple answer to that, if I had to put in one word or one phrase, is it's always a good time to compost. All year round, you should be composting. And while you might, I get what you're saying, because by the time you have mature compost to use, the season will almost be over. But that's exactly when you want that compost, because once you've pulled everything out of the beds, and you're putting your garden beds to bed, you're putting them to sleep, you actually going to want to put a layer of compost on top of that soil. And the reason you want to do that is so that the nutrients and stuff can work into the soil that's already existing there. You can nourish the soil that's there and let it overwinter. So that way, when spring comes back around, you're ready to start planting right away.
Okay. So for this season, and pardon my ignorance, I mean, I'm just learning, and this is an interesting topic. So for this season, we definitely are not going to rely on waste composting for garden, correct?
Yeah, I would say so, because the amount of compost you're going to get out of this. So like even if you fill it to capacity, what happens with compost is it shrinks to about a third. So you're going to be left with just like about that much compost. Once you fill this cell, by the time the process is done, you're going to be left with this much. So you're going to want to build a stockpile of it anyway. So the idea is to do as much as possible, so that you have more material to use when you're ready to plant. So you're going to have to, even if you might not use it for the season, it's a good idea to finish it, store it, and have it ready for next season.
Okay.
And
so
keep the process going.
One last question. I think I'll come back with some more questions, but this one is for now. In the winter season, how does the snow? How does that does it affect the bean when you have snow
Yeah.
meaning, and you know.
That's a great question. Absolutely. So most compost, like when you're talking about aerobic composting, it doesn't technically rely on the atmospheric temperature. It can impact it, but typically the heat is generating from the inside of the bin in the material because it's from the activity of the organisms. So even if the air is cold, your bin can still be hot. Now it depends on how far along in the process it is that it will maintain breaking down. Because if, let's just say, you know, you've had a pile breaking down for 2 months now, and now we're in January, that pile is not going to generate enough heat to maintain the temperature inside to prevent it from freezing. So something like that probably will freeze. But let's just say, for instance, in January, you start a new pile and you're adding new material every week. There's going to be enough heat in there to keep it from freezing. So you'll actually be able to turn fresh material all winter long, so long as it's maintaining its heat.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So,
So let's say that you've seen our box, right? And you know the size of it already. And here is a case that we have 2 apartment buildings, 400 residents in total, I believe. So if we should have every resident bringing in their food waste for us to compost for the period of waiting for the next farming gardening season. Do you think we have the capacity to contain that, or we need maybe 2 or 3 more of the wooden structure for compost?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how much you're actually producing, because one cell can hold up to 1,000 pounds of food. So it's quite a bit, and you have only 12 families contributing to it. It may take them, if they're filling them to the top, if they're filling those green bins to the top every week, then yes, I would recommend getting more. But what you could do is, you know, it's up to you how you want to manage how you're going to use the cells. Like, for instance, if it was me and I had just this one system here, what I would do is I would fill, let's just say you fill one on the right, fill it 7 to 10 days, and then flip it into the middle. And then on the left one, new material can go in there. And then you let that one compile. And then you just keep flipping this one back and forth between the two while this one is filling up. Once that's full, let it sit 7 to 10 days. Make sure that the middle one is empty, and then flip this one into the middle one. And then your middle bit, your right bin, you'll just keep turning with inside that cell. I know it might be confusing, like
I'm just trying to follow the pattern, but again, because this is a recorded video, we will go back to it and try to. And again, I know that you want to do a site visit. So what we're going to do is that remember you donated 12 bins, I think, or so or more. And what we intend doing is to make sure that once all those bins are full, and then we're ready to move it into the, is it a fence? Is it a name used? Is it a fence? The box, you know, and we're ready to move into it. We can then invite you to come in. So once we do our first test, I think we'll need to, but I think this tutorial is amazing so far. It's amazing.
Well, oh, great! I'm glad that it's helpful. I know it's always helpful to actually see it in person and be involved that way, and it's much easier to grasp. But one thing I do want to say is I've noticed in some of the pictures you sent me, it looks like a lot of that material is already starting to rot and break down. So I guess you've collected it a little while ago, and it's still sitting in the green bin. If it's a little broken down, it's a little rotted, that's fine. But if it gets to a point where it's starting to ferment, we may not actually be able to use it. So what I would recommend is not waiting until the green bin is full. I would say just fill it, like just add material within a week, and at the end of the week or at one day in the week, whatever day you guys decide to come into your compost, do that.
That's good. Okay.
And the also benefit is that you don't have waste sitting around your apartment buildings now, right? It's not collecting flies and all that kind of stuff. You don't want that stuff to sit for very long. You do want to get it into the bins and let it start breaking down immediately.
Okay. Okay, and again, thank you very much, because one of the major concerns that we have with the green bean, having them in apartment buildings to ensure that it doesn't kind of invite pests and all that. So it makes sense, and that's why again we decided to transport the beans into the garden so that the residents can just bring it directly to the garden and then put them in a green bin, and once we fill them, maybe after a week or so, then we can now transport it into the box. So I think something that we'll be doing from tomorrow. I will speak with the team here for them to start moving them into the box as and when it comes in on a weekly basis.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that works. That's excellent.
Okay.
So yeah, what we can do is just let me know when you want me to come in and do a tutorial with the group, and then we can go from there. Even if you have just a few.
I think as early as somewhere next week, we should, because like I said, from what you're saying, we already have a couple of them so we can't wait for another week.
Okay.
So it depends on next week. Maybe next week Tuesday, if it's possible, we can bring you in next week Tuesday for us to have our first on-site practicals. And again, we will ensure that we observe the social distancing guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds good. Okay. So just, I guess, a couple things I'll just make sure that it's on the recording here for you guys. Just some troubleshooting items. So if compost has a very bad reputation of being smelly. If managed properly, compost actually shouldn't smell bad. And I mean, I could be biased because I could be nose blind by this point. But if it's being managed properly, you're layering it properly with the right materials and things like that. It will have an odor. It will have a smell. Everything has a smell, but it's not going to smell bad. It's more like it has like a nitrogen smell, which is almost sour. But sometimes what happens is you get that rotten ammonia or rotten egg smell. It's very putrid and very offensive. But if that occurs, it's probably because it's not being managed properly. So it's most likely it's resulting to anaerobic conditions, and you're getting that methane gas. So in certain cases, what you may have to do is just either it could be too much moisture in the bin. So then all you have to do is add dry material to it. So add some browns to it. It may just have to be turned to get some more oxygen in there so that it can start breaking down. Or it could just be that food is left exposed and it should be covered up a little bit more. If there's ammonia odor, it could be that there's too much nitrogen. So there's a lot of green material in there. And at that point, you can just add some more brown. So adding wood chips and things like that. And the other thing to consider is the temperature of the pile. So if the pile temperature is too low, remember I said you want to hit a maximum of 160 degrees, at least for a few days. And then it should kind of range between 120 to 140 for the majority of the time. But if the temperature pile is too low, what it could be is that the pile is too small. It could be the weather, but likely it's not that. It could be typically when that happens is that the material is either too dry or there's not enough air. So in that case, what you're doing, or it could be lacking green material. So what you might have to do is just turn the pile, add some moisture, or maybe even add some fresh scraps to your pile. Typically, you will never have to worry about a pile being too hot. I haven't seen that, but I've heard rumors of people having their piles ignite, but I don't know what they had in there. But in this case, if it is too hot, then it could be that your pile is too big. So you just want to reduce the size or turn the pile and add some browns. All right, so and then compost, our compost buddies here. So keeping these guys away from our food or from the compost. So the idea basically with these guys is what they're attracted to is fatty, oily foods, cooked foods and things like that. So if you're putting that in there and they can smell it, they're going to be attracted to it. Not to say you can't put some bones and some meat in there and even some dairy. Like you can put some of that stuff in there. But if you do put that stuff in there, it should be buried into the middle of the pile. So that way they can't smell it or they can't get to it. So best rule of thumb is just don't include it. But if you do, make sure you bury it in the middle of the pile.
Okay, so those are our good neighbors.
Yes,
I
exactly.
remember the first bean that we had, we put it in the garden, and the next day we came, it's been turned around, and we knew our neighbors came in to do some visitation. My colleague, Kadra, she has a question and she wants to put a question up. Kadra, can you go ahead with your question, please?
Yeah, hi. Just wondering, we wanted to know for the Green Bin Initiative, how others measure their waste.
How to measure it in terms of?
Yeah, how to measure it.
Are you talking about the weight?
Yes.
Yeah, the weight.
So yeah, I think Kwame, I think I gave you one of those scales, the hanging scales.
Yes.
So that's the best way to do it. And what we'll do, whatever. I think I also give you a binder to track it as well. I hope if you don't have it, I can always get you another one.
No, we have the binder. I think what we're missing now is the how to do the measurement. I think you gave us a binder and then the track and the weight device.
Yeah. So what it is basically is when you come to dump the bins into your cells, the green bins, just use that scale and let it hang on the scale. Hopefully it's not too heavy and you can hold it with one hand or however. And then the bin itself, the green bin itself, is typically about 7 pounds. So you would subtract that from the overall weight, and that should give you the amount of waste that you're putting into the bin.
Okay, Kadra, is it clear? Do you have any more questions to ask?
No, I'm just writing down the measurement so we can use that next time when we're doing the measurement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's excellent thing to track. Let you know how much waste you're actually diverting from the landfills and how much of it's actually you're going to be using towards your plants. So yeah, definitely a good thing to track for sure.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadra. So we'll get you on the line again if you have any more questions. I think this is the end of the. Alonso, I think you've come to the end of the presentation. If I'm
That's
correct.
right. Yeah. So if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Okay. Yeah.
I thank you very much for your time, Alonso. It's very straightforward.
Yeah.
I look forward to working with the compost so we could add to the garden. I think it's a great idea, and it makes sense.
Absolutely.
It's straightforward. It's fun. It's good for young people as well. The lasagna, the compost lasagna, it's really good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to working with you guys on this as well.
Okay. So Alonso, on behalf of the Community Reduce and Reuse Program, Share, Reuse, and Learning Center at REX, I want to say a very big thank you to you and FoodShare for your continuous support and assistance in helping us to reach this far with the program. We're very grateful to have you make this presentation for us, and hope that it's going to help us not just for this season, but many more seasons to come in. As a result, our goal is to make sure that we reduce the amount of food waste that goes into landfill. At the same time, we educate residents on the important use of waste and composting, and how that kind of the whole cycle of food not going waste but going back to the soil, and soil helping to germinate, and then fruits and food, and again go back to human consumption and that cycle. So again, this is a value chain, and we're very happy that we have FoodShare playing a very huge component in this value chain program that we have. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and I appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys. I think this is something exciting for the city, especially for there's a lot of buildings that don't do composting, and if this is a model that can be duplicated and replicated throughout the city, then I think it's very exciting. So yeah, I really hope this is successful, and let's do what it takes to make it work.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right, I'll talk to you soon then.
Okay, bye.
All right, bye-bye.